The Mavs caught everyone by surprise when they absolutely mopped the floor with the Phoenix Suns in that game seven. And with a potential all-time great in Luka Doncic turning just 24 years old this season, they're primed to be a factor in the postseason for years to come. And at just a projected 48 and a half wins, this is one of the biggest no-brainers of the year for me. Take the over. This team won 52 games last season, and it wasn't exactly smooth sailing for them for most of the year. Doncic came into the season overweight and out of shape, and as a result, he spent some time banged up to start the season and just struggled early on, at least by his standards. Luka even admitted that his conditioning was an issue last season, so I expect that he was very focused on that this past offseason. Then there was also the Kristaps Porzingis trade at the deadline. And I know KP was in and out of the lineup during his tenure in Dallas, but he was still a pretty key part of what they did game plan wise. And then they had to kind of integrate another ball dominant guard in Spencer Dinwiddie on the fly. That's just never easy. So now having a full offseason to build a system to integrate the new players that they have, and more importantly, having a recommitted Luka Doncic as far as his conditioning goes, I think it seems fairly obvious that this team can at least get to 49 wins, which would be three less than last season. The Mavs were also able to address their team's biggest deficiency from last season, the center spot, with the acquisition of Christian Wood for basically nothing via trade from the Houston Rockets. And then they also signed JaVale McGee through free agency. And if you paid really close attention to the last year's Mavericks playoff run, the center rotation was absolutely what sunk them. Dwight Powell was just completely outmatched for most of the playoffs and looked unplayable at times. I remember during that Suns series, they would start the game with him, but pretty much by the first whistle, they were already subbing in Maxi Kleber. And if you look at the box scores, that's absolutely the case in both the Suns and Warriors series. Powell was out there for like 10 to 15 minutes a game, and with some games where he played something like 7 minutes. And I like Dwight Powell. I think he's solid, but not as a starting center for a team that is competing deep into the playoffs. So that left Maxi Kleber as the primary center option. And like Powell, that's just asking way too much of him. Kleber is one of my favorite role players in the league, but he's just that, a role player. A guy who can give you 10 to 20 solid minutes coming off the bench as a stretch five or in the starting lineup as a stretch four, not 30 minutes a game as the only playable center on the roster. Now, Dwight Powell can be used on an as needed basis for when the Mavs run up against teams like the Timberwolves or the Cavs, basically just those teams with multiple big guys and a big front line. And when they play small ball teams like the Warriors or the Clippers, they just won't have to use him at all. Kleba won't have to play starter type minutes anymore at the five. He can play spot minutes as the small ball five or the stretch four like he's supposed to. As for the new guys, let's start off with Christian Wood. And I know he's viewed as a bit of a malcontent and just a locker room problem, but I actually think a lot of that is a bit overblown. And sure, if you look at his time in Houston in a vacuum, he was a huge pain in the ass, but you're missing a lot of context there. Think about his career thus far. He bounces around on a few teams early on, not really getting a ton of playing time, and just kind of fights and scraps and claws his way to a prominent role on a really putrid Pistons team. He carves out a role there as just this awesome roll man off the pick and roll. And so in the 2020 offseason, he decides to sign with the Houston Rockets, expecting to compete for a championship, playing alongside one of the best pick and roll ball handlers in league history in James Harden, only for Harden to almost immediately kick and scream his way out of town. So now Wood went from playing with an established all NBA level point guard on a team with title aspirations to babysitting a complete teardown and rebuild of the Rockets. So, yeah, I think it's a little understandable that he would be upset about that situation because it was not what he was promised. I do think it's a little ironic, though, that the Rockets are finally holding up their end of the bargain to Christian Wood, pairing him with a different generational pick and roll ball handler. JaVale McGee is also a really significant pickup. They add another pick and roll partner for Luka, but more importantly, replacing Kristaps Porzingis. And honestly, as a defensive anchor, I think McGee might even be an upgrade over Porzingis. And when you start to think about some of the teams out west that they could be potentially matching up with in the playoffs, it was crucial for them to address the center spot this offseason. Because come playoff time, you're going to be looking at Jokic and the Timberwolves with Cat and Gobert, maybe Anthony Davis if the Lakers can make it into the playoffs and AD can remain healthy. Even guys like DeAndre Ayton on the Suns could be a handful if they're left unchecked. And while McGee isn't going to be shutting any of those guys down, he can at least compete and make them work a little bit. So I absolutely think, at least on paper, this year's Mavs team is better than last year's, even with a pretty significant loss in Jalen Brunson. And sure, Brunson was really valuable to what the Mavs did at like a 16 a game score, but more importantly, he was a guy who could create his own shot when Luka was either on the bench or just when they wanted to get him off the ball. But I actually think they're pretty well equipped to kind of cobble together that production with what they already have on the roster. I think you can give more touches to Spencer Dinwiddie. He's stylistically, at least, pretty similar to Brunson. Also, you're presumably getting back a healthy Tim Hardaway Jr., who on the right night can look really good as a shot creator. And then maybe not this year, but at some point, second round pick Jaden Hardy might actually be someone to keep an eye on. If you go and you look back at some of the mock drafts from the beginning of last season, Hardy was projected around the top 10. But after a pretty underwhelming year with the G League Ignite, he dropped like a rock. And this G League Ignite thing is really new, so we don't know really whether it's a good or bad thing for the development of young players. Just from a bird's eye and like a surface level observation, it it doesn't seem like a great idea to me. It just feels like guys are going to be fighting way too hard to showcase what they can do so that they can just improve their draft position. It just seems like it's creating a situation where everyone is constantly stepping on each other's toes, and it just might not be the best development situation for every player. So maybe if Hardy had gone to college, he still would have been a lottery pick. Who knows? But either way, I think taking a flyer on him in the second round is really good value for the Mavericks as like a low risk, high reward type situation. Even if Dinwiddie ends up struggling like he did most of the playoffs, or Tim Hardaway Jr. struggles or can't get healthy, and Hardy doesn't really pan out, and the Mavericks find that they really do need that secondary playmaker, shot creator, there are tons of guys who could potentially be available to them via trade that could fill that role where the Mavericks wouldn't have to give up too much to get them. Just off the top of my head, Utah would be happy to give up either Mike Conley or Jordan Clarkson. You've got potentially Eric Gordon out there in Houston, maybe Terry Rozier if things just completely fall apart with the Hornets, and then Buddy Hield with Indiana. There are more than that, more names than that. But my point is, it's just really easy to find good value at that spot. A lot of teams will just let these guys go just to get out of their contracts in a lot of cases. Dallas doesn't have their 2023 draft pick, but they pretty much have all of their first round picks moving forward. And when you have a contract like Davis Bertans with only 2 years left on it, at the salary figure it's going to give them a ton of flexibility via trade. Although, if I'm being honest, I really like how big this team is. A lot of teams would view having a 6'7" point guard as an excuse to play a smaller score first guard alongside him in the backcourt. But I I like that the Mavericks are kind of viewing this the other way, as a way to just run a whole bunch of tall, switchable wing players and using it as a way that they can really shore up this defense, since they're not going to have a small player out there that your opponent can easily exploit in mismatches. So I like the Mavericks this year. They improved in the offseason and they have the assets and contracts available to make another move or two at the deadline this season. I still would consider them a dark horse finals team, not a favorite to win the West by any means. But having said that, I wouldn't be totally shocked if they did.